Okay,
my overwordiness, which you'll have to have on record, which is so sad, but
that's okay.
my verbosity. So history of corporate prayer. So the two women that were prayer mentors or mentors, spiritual mentors in my life, just both happened to be prayer warriors, for lack of a better term, I guess, and helped me grow as a Christian, largely in the discipline of praying with them. So we got together, and one was in high school, and we would sit around her table and we would pray. We baked bread, and so as the bread would rise, which took 2 or 3 times, we'd sit at her kitchen table, we would engage in prayer. And I was 16 years old, and I had never had that experience in my life. And, she talked to God like she really knew him, and we prayed together. And there's a rhythm in corporate prayer, right? It's not just you pray your list and then I'll pray my list. There's some beautiful synergy that comes when it's truly corporate, right? So that really laid the foundation of my life for a love and appreciation for corporate prayer. Fast forward to my life as a young mother, going back to work just part-time as a teacher. So I found a lady in my church who could watch the kids in the morning. When I would come pick them up once a week, we would pray together. And she was pray the word, declare the scriptures as you prayed. And she was up and walking around, none of this sitting down stuff, and, really just she was a soft, gentle spirit. But, when she went to prayer, and again, just another chapter or another, facet in looking at corporate prayer. So then I've always just found such a high value of corporate prayer as well as individual prayer. My husband and I are disciplined to pray regularly together, almost daily. And there's so much strength and power when you come together with another person to pray. I developed a schema for prayer retreats, where you take a group anywhere from 5 to maybe the largest group's been maybe 18 through a 24-hour prayer event. And it's just always been so wonderfully received and awesome. It's just so exciting to take people away who are like, there's no way you can pray for 24 hours. I'm like, I think there is. And then have them, experience it and find it very meaningful. And so those are just a few snapshots of why corporate prayer is a passion and an interest of mine. And so as I started to explore the research, and of course, my doctorate's in education. And so I'm very familiar with the whole quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods style of research. So when I got into this program, I realized, we're talking more about historical research, and you go find the expert voices and you become an expert, and then you add to the corpus of knowledge in that area from your own particular. But you can find a million books on prayer. You cannot find very many on corporate prayer. And the ones that do exist, maybe half dozen to 10, written in the last maybe 10 years, don't talk a lot. There's no data. They bemoan the fact that corporate prayer is done so poorly, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and not a lot of empirical evidence on, well, exactly how are we praying? Like, what do we do together? What are the prayer practices in church right now, 21st century? How do we use the altar? How do we use prayer meetings? How do we incorporate prayer in a service? So it's just an interest of mine. I kind of am like, I would like to be able to write and have some evidence.
Okay.
So now I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. No, it's got me thinking about 2 or 3 things. So you use the language corporate prayer, which I tend to, in my liturgical brain, translate into the prayer book or the prayers of the people within that kind of history and time, as opposed to community or communal prayer, which can include antiphonal or types of prayer practices. Sure. By the way, one reason I record these things is so I can provide that for you later too. So I get ADD, and you would write me back and say, "No, you mentioned what?" And I'll go, "Okay, I am a man of a certain age." So there have been, just to name 2 or 3 in the history of the church broadly. it's one thing to think about corporate prayer through the prayer book or different, even the Catholic Mass, those
Right.
kinds of ways, which are
Yep.
highly structured
Yep.
and occur. And we might even think about it through sometimes through hymnody and prayer uh,
Yes.
and worship services. But
Yep.
there are models, African American tradition of call and response forms of prayer
Yep.
that do happen in their worship services. The first thing that came to mind for me would be the kind of prayer that happened a lot of times in camp meetings, which would be
Mhm.
more corporate in nature. Or you may be aware the older cottage prayer movement
Hmm.
that I think might be an interesting piece of this,
Yeah.
where people would gather normally in conjunction to either missions or some
Revivals.
pray for revival, be classic spiritual deepening, but they'd have these cottage prayer events that
Okay.
might have a little bit of guidance, but normally once people started praying, it was on. I mean, so there'd be one way. I don't know if that's a theological phrase or not, but there was this deep sort of interaction. So there might be within what I would call evangelical American holiness or holiness movements, different expressions of communal prayer that actually there might be some accounts and history behind that might be intriguing
Wonderful.
to look at, and how prayer actually did. And this word may sound odd, so don't hold it against me, but how prayer functioned
Yeah.
to both draw the spirit in,
Yeah.
empower people, and make and
Yeah.
create community.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the most recent book I know that would sort of provide a more of a sociology of religions, either a sociological or anthropological approach to that, was a book by Nancy Ammerman, and the title of the book is Lived Religion.
Okay.
And there is this kind of movement that's just basically saying, rather than talking about what people believe, how is it that they practice their religion?
Yes.
And there is the whole practicing our faith movement. I mean, there's 2 or 3 different movements around this, but there is this kind of movement of just saying from the grassroots up, how is it that this communal, for you, it'd be the communal prayer. It might be other things, but how does this work? And she's done some really interesting work, I think, that might tie in.
I'll get
Um,
it.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
I am thinking, since you talk about more of historical, one way to think about your EDD and what the DMin is trying to do. This is Dean Blevins' interpretation, not Susan Carroll's interpretation. So I
Okay.
always say this is how I tend to interpret it. That may not always be true, but you know how professors are. Each of us are right in our own minds
I
anyway.
do.
But if you even look at the structure, or if you get a copy of the outline of the DMin, it looks like an EDD project up to a point. So you got the sort of problem statement, the review of literature,
Yes. Yep.
and in an EDD, normally about the 3rd chapter, you're coming up with your intervention and methodology.
Yep.
So it's kind of a kind of underlying theoretical frame, but mainly, and this is the methodology you construct. The next chapter is, and this is how you applied it in
Yep.
classrooms or somewhere. And then the final is use of results.
Mhm.
And what happened was when our DMINs shifted, what we decided was, and this is true in a lot of DMIN programs, is that the social science was not really well done. So a lot of the interventions, sometimes some programs had really strong IRB review and use of human subjects questions coming up, but others not so much. And even in our program, the interventions were attempted to be modest. I mean, we're talking about pastors working in churches, but often then the use of results were very, the bar was pretty low, and the results were confounded, conflicted, or confound. I love that word, confounded,
Yep.
because often the pastor did not know how to design a rigorous social science intervention.
Yep.
And I watched many of those. I mean, so like one pastor came that they would often create very interesting pieces around the actual intervention, but for instance, they'd say, well, our church needs to be more compassionate, so I'll preach a series of sermons on compassion. I'll pre-test and post-test. And on more than one occasion, I would look at the pastor at the end, and I never will forget one of them. I said, you taught this, you preached this series in the summer. So what is the, over a 6-week series, what's the real viability that the majority of your congregation was in all 6 of those sermons when you preached?
Right.
Or half, or a third, or may have showed up for the first one and the last one. So how do you know that the survey was really tracking the growth of the congregation as a whole?
Right.
To which the pastor went, that's a good question,
Yeah.
So when they changed the DMIN, they said, rather than construct a social science experiment that we know may or may not be rigorous enough,
Right.
can you make a theoretical argument that's
Yeah.
robust enough that it could carry the day based on more of a humanities level engagement?
Yeah.
Or can you at least construct an artifact
Right.
that has good opportunity to bring about change in light of what you've learned? And so that's why we have those 2 options now of a dissertation or a dissertation plus artifact. We're not asking you in the dissertation, at least, that you have to do the social science work. But instead, what we're saying is either borrow from social science that's out there and weave that into your research, or construct something that you think is compelling enough that other people who know the field would look at your artifact and say, yeah, that could be used by someone else, and it's compelling enough that it warrants a good use of your research up to that level, which frankly, we saw a lot. Sometimes we'd see some of the most creative interventions. So they were decent. It was actually the structure of the intervention tracking it. I mean, both pre-test and post-testing, that was really so bad. And the school as a whole decided that's just not a game that we wanted to constantly play.
Sure.
So if you're going to do if you're thinking about long-term, a research project on communal prayer and thinking more of a extended dissertation that draws more on making an argument and drawing from the wealth of a historical base, then, saying, well, what I experience, what I see today, how does that correspond to the power of something like a cottage prayer movement, or the use of prayer and Wesley's groups? And has there been research in that? But it would be more of a historical correlation, and trying to find some point of correspondence than it would be social science. But if you're going to do more, what might this look like long term? I think how much social science you put into it and how much the school can help can provide a review committee to follow with that is something you probably need to talk to Dr. Carroll carefully about. I mean, I'm not worried about you having a command of that methodology. It's just who are going to be your reviewers down the road to ask those kinds of questions. And it sounds like if you're looking at communal prayer largely, then use of human subjects, definitely around vulnerable subjects, are not going to be a question mark unless families get involved. And you know that as well as I do. I do think I know Jaron had connected you with Rich Housel and also with Dr. Stan Reeder. So are you thinking about doing some initial research, maybe if nothing more than do some survey work to determine what the current practice is, which would be more descriptive work you could add to your final dissertation? Is that what you got in mind?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I would say that, and I'll go ahead and put it this way. I know Stan's very interested in, Dr. Reeder is very interested in prayer. You may have known him when he was in Portland, I don't know, or in the Oregon district of the Church of the Nazarene.
I didn't know him because I'm not Nazarene.
Okay.
I didn't know him. I heard today as I was talking to Grant that he was from this area. So I'll have to ask my husband, who grew up with Jaron in Lebanon, Oregon. Grant told me just by the by that Stan Reeder also, I think, was from Lebanon, Oregon. So,
Okay. And I think Stan at one point was Canadian. So I think he was also, so I don't know if he's a transplant from Canada down into Oregon or the other way around, but he does have Northwest roots. That would be part of it. Rich is a really good researcher. So if you can get his attention, I think if it could be a well-crafted research, whether it's distributed out to all the pastors or if it's more of a focus survey for a representative sample, I think he'd be really helpful to help you think through the questions you would want to ask. I think for some of our churches, I do think helping them think through the difference between corporate worship as when we gather for worship, corporate prayer as when we gather for worship and we pray, versus communal prayer when we gather together and pray, might be something to kind of think through your survey and how to best ask those questions.
That's very helpful. Those are helpful distinctions. At this point, I'm still in the, gathering information stage. And so I realize corporate prayer, it can be anything from like responsive reading and even worship, singing songs is a form of prayer, right? Because you're talking to God. And so corporate prayer practices, how is prayer how do you incorporate prayer into your traditional gatherings? And then where does prayer show up in other aspects of your church life? And then communal prayer. So, you could say, corporate prayer also is when you have a weekly prayer meeting and you structure a weekly prayer meeting. So something I think could be both corporate and communal, right? Because so teasing out those two buckets and seeing even how we understand those terms, I think will be interesting and helpful maybe. But I agree with you with framing that on a survey so that pastors understand what they're answering. Because if you just say, explain your corporate prayer practices, but really helping unpack that for them so we get better data back, and even could be helpful to them in terms of comprehending the role of prayer and what it is.
Yeah, I think if you were to do something that's more time dated, so I'm just going to name it that way, but would be intriguing, is a number of attempts at Wednesday night prayer groups on Zoom during COVID, and the rise of, but the interesting thing was the rise of that phenomenon. So I don't know about the Northwest, but I do know in parts of the Midwest, things that would have been a Bible teaching with prayer, so on a Wednesday night, for instance, really went to becoming just prayer meetings and offering prayer requests and praying together. It is interesting whether there was that kind of spontaneity in those Zoom meetings or not, and what gets lost. But you might find some research around that area.
Yeah,
some people curious about that. So
I'll just write a little note about that. You see how COVID and impact on virtual prayer meetings.
Yeah,
could be a chapter.
Yeah, it might. It may end up being a very small section, but even whether or not that produced some renewed interest in those kinds of prayer meetings, or if there have been anything that's followed, I think it'd be interesting again, something Rich could ask is, did you have prayer meetings during the virtually, and have you continued the meetings? And the implications of that might be something to be sort of helping to know what the current. I wouldn't so much think about it as, again, an intervention pre-test, post-test, but more of a survey to get a sense of the landscape. That would be something that might be really helpful.
I think that is my goal. I'm looking at it as an opportunity to gather data on current practices across the Nazarene denomination, and then with that data, do an examination of what's happening? Like what, when we talk about this dearth of corporate prayer or communal prayer, you know, is that true? If so, is there one part of the country where that's truer or not true at all? You know, it's just, I think I like data. I think I think data is very, I don't want to say stuff in a paper that people just have generally agreed, oh, that feels true to me. I want to know that it is true and then talk about it. So.
Yeah, no. And, you know, normally you only have one. Well, you'll find in most of the work in theological education, you either have to generate that data, in other words, well, I'll come back to something, or else you go to people who are quote unquote experts in the field and you go with their generalizations, which normally are just that, their generalizations, but at least they've been around long enough that you can just kind of point at them like they're supposed to be knowledgeable people who do this well. And there's a wonderful article by Christian Smith, circa 2004, 2005, the title of it, and I'll send it to you.
Oh, thank you.
Evangelicals Behaving Badly with Statistics. I don't know if you know Christian Smith's work.
I do. He's out of Calvin, right? Or
no, he's Christian. That's James K. Smith.
That's James. Okay.
Is that now at Notre Dame? He was originally at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Okay.
And then the National Survey on Youth and Religion, that early 2000s, no one had ever done that kind of breadth of study. And so it really set a benchmark for that kind of multi-level study that he has milked for over 20 years. And he's continued even to track those youth and their experiences into emerging adulthood and now into being parents. So he has two more recent books on how, you know, in some ways, how do contemporary parents, which would be consistent with these young adults that he first studied, or youth that he first studied, how do they parent their children? How do they raise them up in the faith or not, and what that looks like? So he's just he's a sociologist of religion that has a lot of street level cred. Because of the work he actually did when he was he was still the chair of sociology at the University of North Carolina, but eventually he made the journey to Notre Dame, and his theological roots he's by going there, he can be both a theologian and a sociologist and get away with both, something UNC Chapel Hill was not going to necessarily let him do very well. But he wrote this wonderful article about how he had noticed, this is back in his days as a sociologist, how a lot of times evangelicals would misquote statistics and then just keep misquoting the people who misquoted them. Yeah. And he created the golden thread that just made us all very nervous when it came to statistical citations afterwards. So it's a good article to have in your hip pocket.
Okay.
The other organization you might want to look at, and I'll send you the link, and if this is again while I'm recording, is that it goes by the acronym ARDA, ARDA. And I think that stands for the American Religious Data Archive. Don't hold me to that.
Okay, sounds believable.
But it is a well-financed by organizations like the Lilly Endowment. It's grant funded. And I think it's at the University of Pennsylvania. But they collect a lot of denominational studies on religious practices. They archive and keep all the general religion data. And if there has been anyone who's sort of asked this question about praying in community and what are those practices, and whether it is Nazarene or Baptist or Catholic, they probably would have not only a summary of that study, but often they will archive the actual original data,
Wonderful.
which gives, I mean, not that you want to spend an entire semester doing statistics, but at least you could go back and say, does this data have 2 or 3 questions in it, for
Yeah.
instance, that helps me know about how in this denomination they pray, and even think about this language, pray together.
Right.
Would be the way to look at that. So I'll send you that link. That'll at least get you. Rich is Dr. Housel is very familiar with the organization. He's part of it. And he is part of a group called the Association for Nazarenes Association for Nazarene Social Researchers,
Okay.
which are normally several faculty or in the fields of sociology, some in education, who meet about every other year and share a lot of that kind of research and data. So he would be the kind of person that might even connect you to someone he knows who's done similar kind of work already, that comes out of one of our colleges or universities. And I'm thinking in the Church of Nazarene, you might want to be broader than that. Your background is Church of God, is that right? Or
I currently go to a Church of God. Mhm.
okay, so you might want to look at holiness or some kind, bounding it somehow. But that might be, Rich might be able to help you to see if there's anybody who's done that kind of work before. So,
Wonderful.
okay.
Thank you very much.
Is this helpful?
Yes, got
Okay.
lots of great resources to explore. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Very
I
helpful.
have a really bad habit of being a professor who just has too many points of curiosity. So if a couple of them definitely turn out to be rabbit trails, I apologize in advance.
I like
But
to learn too, so this is good.
okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I think one thing I will mention that I think got Jaron interested in our having a conversation is, I don't know if you know the project I'm directing at the seminary at this point.
Is it the $500,000 mobilization?
No, it is where we received a Lilly Endowment grant looking at young children, elementary
Okay.
school children, and nurturing their worship and prayer practices in the life of congregations. And so Lilly Endowment has recently started 2 initiatives. One is resourcing parents and the religious formation of children. So the focus is children. It really is, and elementary school children in particular. And one half of the focus has been on parenting and raising up children. And there have
Yeah.
been several organizations that have received grants on that, including Olivet Nazarene University.
Oh,
We received one of the initial invitation grants to focus on worship and prayer in and through the life of the congregation, and basically how to deepen children's experience of God through prayer practices and worship practices. And
well,
so
as a
we're
school
going to,
principal, that's very interesting to me.
yeah, and we are actually my initiative, we split it, so part of it's in Kansas City, and that one's the most ambitious. So we proposed, how do we help cultivate through a posture of care better worship and prayer practices with children with autism.
Oh,
So we're working in a very niche kind of setting. The other half of the grant, we're going to be in Northern California working with a lot of ethnically diverse communities, smaller communities, basically saying, how can we help them improve the worship and prayer practices of children? We anticipate primarily through intergenerational worship in those settings.
okay.
So that's been our work. And we just finished a survey at General Assembly that took a look at basically children's and their parents. So we surveyed both parents. We did ran it through California Baptist University's School of Psychology. So we did an IRB funded endorsed project where we surveyed both children and adults around their experiences of prayer and worship. And that survey, about 200 adults responded and about 100 children. So we're
Great.
trying to sort out the data for that. But
Uh-huh.
that's different from what your focus is from that standpoint. But I just didn't know if that's why when I asked, I thought maybe Jaron thought you had also had an interest in, you know, children's experience of corporate worship and what that might be about. But it sounds like, I mean, you know as well as I do, that's moving into a whole different area of conversation as opposed to adults in these kind of corporate settings that are often.
It is, it's different. I went back and forth. One of the, I've done some thinking and presenting on Christian schools and Christian school prayer practices, and what it means to become a praying school. And I was kind of down that road thinking about, wow, I could easily create materials as in my artifact for my dissertation. And it isn't outside the realm of possible if this survey, if for some reason my conversations with Dr. Reeder don't lead to that possibility, is because I've been in Christian school, the Christian school movement for 30 plus years. I'm well connected. I used to be the regional director for ACSI in the Northwest. And so I have a lot of relationship with Christian school heads, and not just in the Northwest, but among my colleagues across the United States. But thinking about about children's prayer practices, faculty prayer practices, how you create a praying community in your Christian school. And so it's certainly of interest to me. Your research sounds fascinating. I'd love to see what your results were. I think Christian schools are a natural place to also explore. How are you having your children pray? How are you teaching them to pray? And the reality is, if their teachers aren't modeling prayer, I'm sure you've seen that Jana Magruder's, nothing less, right? Nothing less than a whole Bible makes a whole Christian, is kind of from the Tozer quote. Anyway, one of the findings of the research that came out of that Lifeway research was when children see prayer modeled, it was one of the 5 top influencers of their own faith as teens and young adults, was seeing adults read their Bibles and reading it with them, and seeing adults pray and praying with them. And so that's fascinating. I use some of that data when I do presentations. So it's a fascinating topic. All that to say, a wonderful topic.
Well, I appreciate that. We've been working with, and I'll send you. So let me full stop for just a second. So you have a passion, and you need to hear from me as a professor at Nazarene Theological Seminary. You push that passion. I've got a project, and I'm not trying to compel you to join this project. So I hope you hear that.
Okay.
But I do think we might have some interesting crossover conversations down the road. So that might be one way to think about it. We were asking, I am part of it's a bigger project at Point Loma it's called moral integration, that we started 5 years ago. And it is a part of this grant as well, that it just basically says, how do we help congregations become more caring? And so this is sort of moral psychology meets Wesleyan theology is the best way to say it. And how is it that we inculcate within a congregation deeper sense of caring for each other? We felt this was important both from a theoretical and theological standpoint, but we also felt it was important in light of our current context, where congregations are so divided these days, that if we could foster a posture of care, that it would make a difference in the lives. So we're using kind of a virtue education model around that, but we're tying it to practices of congregational prayer and congregational worship. That's
wonderful.
The best way. And so the people we're working with, they created an adult curriculum that actually is pretty efficacious. We already know that, to help in small groups to learn how to inculcate the virtue of care. But one of the things that I had argued is it doesn't have legs as long as you just have people in small groups talking about it, unless you have a place where it's being practiced and engendered. And so this gives us a chance to explore that. So there might be if for some reason things don't go well, so I hope you hear what I'm about to say. You might, even if you can't do the demographic work through the denomination, if there's some reason there's not an interest in that, there may still be sufficient work to make an argument for out of the ARDA archives. I mean, it might be just finding out who else has already done this kind of work. And all you're trying to do is set a baseline for, is it something that churches pay attention to, and is it efficacious? But then you could easily write a dissertation, if you wanted to, around how does these communal forms of prayer, though there are multiple, in these very unique configurations historically, like camp meeting prayer or cottage prayer. And if you could, I mean, maybe I want to be very careful. DMin is not supposed to be a PhD. So I do not want you ending up reading tons of diaries of people who went through cottage prayer experiences.
I would love to. And that's my jam. So I wouldn't care if I had to. So.
Well, I mean, if you did that kind of work, then you would definitely be producing a very robust DMin. Let's just say it that way. But if you could come up with a compelling argument for how historically this has been something that was part of revival, part of renewal within the life of the church, that this has been very strategic to Christian mission, I think it would be enough to make the case for why we need to pay close attention to that and reprise that as a part of our everyday practice in the life of the church today. So that's just a slightly different way of getting at the work you want to do. And then you would determine what level of argument how robust the argument need to be to finish the DMin. But I think even rather than talking about the church in general, but thinking about different periods or expressions of the church when they gather for communal prayer, and what kind of work's been done either in the history of the church or even more recently about how that experience has been efficacious, would just be a good way of even doing maybe a semester's worth of work to kind of figure out what you want to kind of come out of it with.
Well, I hope I can find that. I haven't found a lot of specific studies like what did prayer in this decade look like, or this, I looked at revivals and looked at, then again, there's probably a lot of unearthed treasures out there, and I'm just not finding my way to them.
Yeah. So
what did happen, what was prayer like in the 1800s, the 1900s, the 2000s, so maybe this Alta or Arda source will be able to give me some, and if I Google cottage prayer, I hope I find something. If
well, that would be, and you may have to hang out with a couple of musty historians before it's over with.
I'd be okay with that. I need to know who they are and just to introduce myself. So
that I can help do. I can help create. So there've been 2 or 3 that have really been sort of I don't know if I call them experts, but they just hang around with the whole movement. And I can send you the name of a couple of them just to see if there've been articles that they've written.
Sure.
That gesture that way. For instance, a guy named Stephen Cooley was really interested in the music of the early camp meetings that people participated in, and what the religious imagery engendered. So he was asking a different set of questions, but he spent a lot of time in that work. And it might be that he's also written other articles. He was at one point the archivist for the Church of the Nazarene, and so he a lot of times had access just because it was his day job. And our most recent retired archivist his name is Stan Ingersoll, and Stan would be the kind of guy that would literally, if you could swap emails with him and have a phone call, he'd be the first one to say, yeah, I've seen work on that. And he might be aware maybe less firsthand accounts, though he might know those, but he might be aware of certain books on cottage prayer of the, early 19th century that he could say, you ought to take a look at, and then you're getting these accounts, handbooks, if you will, of how that functioned in that day.
That'd be wonderful. I mean,
So
there's no substitute for the, primary resources, right? Primary sources with the firsthand words of the people who experienced it. It's so powerful.
yeah. But I don't want to, I mean, again, any one, it's not that you need to do all these. It's really what's one kind of way of getting through this conversation. If you're going to take more of the survey will help set the context. But if you're thinking about how to then to move forward to the end of the dissertation, and Susan is much like though we definitely went through different programs. She has more of a humanities-based background than a social science. I tend to live in both worlds because of my work in practical theology and just all the on the ground kinds of things in the field of education that I've done. But she might either she or someone else could help you kind of narrow down the historical, so you don't feel like you're having to come in either cast the net so wide you don't find anything, it just gets lost, or you get lost, or you go down a pathway for a whole semester and realize there's just not enough there. So it's trying to find that middle space between those two.
Exactly.
I know you're aware of that, but it's just once you start hanging around with church historians, I can get you in trouble. Now, I will say this is Dean Blevins, the practical theologian. There are times when church historians really do want you to become a church history expert. Your dissertation is not designed to do that.
No.
And if you get a church historian, if you suddenly feel like somebody's trying to say, well, what you really need to do is go read these 85 different accounts that are located all over the USA. I'll speak for Susan. We'll just both say, no, you don't have to do that. Okay. So you need to hear that up front. What we're trying to do is help you find someone who's already done that kind of work. And it's easier for you to draw through their work into what you're trying to make more application for today. So I hope that makes sense.
It does. I appreciate that a lot. So yeah, I've got a call scheduled with her the first week of the term, and I'll let her know, so this semester's paper, I'm hoping to write it on the altar call. So what has that played historically, as a place of prayer? And so I've gone and accessed the NTS databases, and I have about 25 articles that I found in the databases, and I've got those printed off ready to read through and annotate, and I keep notes and everything. So, but I think I'll look at this whole cottage prayer movement, and I will see what I can find on ARDA and see what spring semester's paper ought to be about.
Okay. All right. Well, if you feel like all I've done is make work for you, I do apologize.
No,
I will.
No.
There is one other person, and even if you're thinking about a second reader down the road who might be good, his name is Dirk Ellis. And Dirk's PhD came from Andrews University, but he looked at liturgical practices in the Church of the Nazarene and its connection to church renewal. And he has a book out. I can't think of the name of it. I'll send you a link. He is a pastor. He's an executive pastor in Arizona. Sunrise, Arizona, but he just found that was an easier place to land for him. But I read his original PhD, which was like 600 to 700 pages. He was so here what I'm about to say though. So I'll say this: Dirk got stuck between the School of Divinity at Andrews University and the School of Education. And they had just moved the PhD program out of the School of Education into the School of Divinity. So he had to literally write 2 dissertations. One is all social science research that he did with Rich, and he got a lot of information on liturgical practices in Church of the Nazarene. Now, these would have been more than 10 years ago, but he had a set of questions, and Rich helped him. So he's very comfortable with that empirical side. But then he had to do this deep historical dive into the history of the Church of the Nazarene and its response to liturgical practices. So he is very good at both ends. He doesn't try to put his students through both of them. So fair that, but at least when you're talking to him, you'd have someone who would get both sides of your interest in what you're trying to accomplish. And though he might not have done the communal prayer component, he would at least know the kinds of questions you're trying to get at. And that he may end up being a good second reader down the road or a conversation partner.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Even more than I. Okay.
That's wonderful.
Okay.
You've been very helpful. Thank you so much for taking.
Well, I'm really bad that, that famous phrase, sometimes you ask somebody what time it is, and the next thing you know, they're telling you how to build a clock. So I have that. I can't help myself on this part. And the fact I'm on sabbatical just means fewer. I'm not afflicting as many students these days.
Are you on sabbatical?
In theory, this grant definitely changed.
You're working. You're in your office.
Well, I'm my home office.
Okay.
But the grant definitely changed my sabbatical plans. It came. It was the strangest thing. It came almost out of nowhere. We wrote the planning grant. We submitted that in September, received notification in October that it had been approved as a 1-year planning grant, but was also instructed that the final grant submission was due by January.
Oh.
So
that's not a year to plan.
So we're still sort of trying to live through the planning grant. We submit the January one, assuming we would be notified sometime in September by the time the planning grant was over or coming to an end. To be notified, we would be told we'd be notified midsummer. And so I'm working on this survey, and I write them in March saying, I don't know when that grant's going to be approved, but do I need to turn in a revised budget narrative on the planning grant? Now this is March, and I go, no, that's okay. You're going to get we've already approved you for the major grant.
Wow.
So we've hit the ground running. As a matter of fact, we've hit the ground sort of saying, "Oh, help me, Jesus." So we've been, just trying to catch up to our goals inside the planning grant.
Congratulations. Congratulations. God's in the work. That's wonderful.
It's amazing. And we're hoping to learn a lot. So I have an incubator here in Kansas City on Monday with some of the churches around, coming up with new ways of engaging children with autism. And then I'll be out on the West Coast in October to kind of start that initiative, to say the least. But I'll let it go. I know we've been at it for about an hour. Has school started for you guys?
No, we don't start officially till the day after Labor Day, but I've been hard at work hiring and training and getting the facilities ready. So it's crazy. So
is this your first year as principal or second year as principal?
My second year here, but I've been in Christian ed for a very long time. So yeah. So it's my second year at Columbia Christian.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my prayers for you.
Thank you.
I suspect, I know you've had a lot of experience, but it's a new I suspect you're getting your sea legs down in that context, to say.
Yes, absolutely. You're right.
Okay.
So,
all right. Well, if you come back toward Kansas City, yell at me. If anything I send you, you want follow-on information, don't be shy. Just email me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you can definitely with Rich. I don't know with Stan, but definitely with Rich, you can name drop me.
Okay, I sure will. Thank you.
Because I've worked with Rich on several projects in the past, and he is, if he takes it on, he's very easy to work with. I do think Dr. Reeder will be intrigued by this because of his interest in prayer mobilization. So I think you may get good approval or access. But if things don't seem to be going well, be sure to reach back out to me. Nothing
will.
else. At least I'm local. I could, I could call Rich or and just see if there's ways to be helpful for you. So think of me that way as an advocate. Okay.
I appreciate that. So Dr. Reeder's office did get back to me. We have something set up, but Hazel, the other person, Stan, I haven't heard back from yet. So if I don't hear back from him in a couple of weeks, maybe I'll shoot you an email and say, hey, drop a little bug in his ear.
I can do that. So it's Stan Reeder. I'm bad. First names. It's
Stan Reeder. So I have a meeting with him, but not Rich, I guess.
Rich. Okay. And the fact that you name dropped him by first names is probably not helpful for you, but it's when you're in Kansas City, I spend a lot of time over at the Global Ministry Center. I often joke that I'm a pretty cheap date. From that standpoint. I mean, not many frequent flyer miles between Olathe and Lenexa, so they utilize me on certain projects at times.
Wonderful.
But I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Okay.
I will send you a link to the video.
Okay.
And I may run an idea by you. I didn't want to do it today,
Okay.
where you might be helpful for me, but I didn't want to make our meeting today about that. I really wanted to know where you were interested in. And if it is, it'll be a totally different conversation. We'll just see how that plays out.
Great.
Okay?
I'm looking forward to it.
All right.
Please do.
Thanks.
Okay. Take care. Thank you so much for your help. Okay.
You're
Bye-bye.
welcome. Blessings.
You too. Bye.